Welcome to Unity Now, the podcast where we discuss Unity stemming from the Unity 2020 plan with one goal in mind: bring Unity to America and end the Republican-Democrat duopoly. This podcast is created, produced, hosted, recorded, edited, and publicized by a wonderful team of Unity volunteers that came together from all over the country to collaborate in a completely remote environment. To provide a brief introduction to Unity, we offer this. Unity 2020 was an idea that started when Brett Weinstein announced the plan on the Joe Rogan Experience in mid-June 2020. From there, the movement was born, and since then, tens of thousands of volunteers have signed up, organized, and begun to create a groundswell of support. The plan always introduced a fail-safe so we would not be an election spoiler. This was to end the plans for the 2020 election if it was determined there was no viable path to the White House. Sadly, this became the case. In keeping our promise, this fail-safe was executed and announced by Brett Weinstein. However, we believe Unity continues to be the number one antidote for what ails the country right now, and so we are pressing on with a renewed spirit. To learn more and become a volunteer, visit articlesofunity.org and check out Brett Weinstein's YouTube page and the Articles of Unity YouTube page for the weekly campfires.
Welcome back to Unity Now. I'm Gabe Garber, and today I'm joined by Desmund Shirazi. Desmond is a fellow Unity volunteer who was instrumental in leading the discussions on the Campfire S'mores series that ran in late summer, fall 2020. He somewhat recently retired from the financial industry and currently sits on the board of directors for Spirit Rock Insight Meditation Center. Thanks for joining us today, Desmond.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here. It's really an honor to have the opportunity to have this conversation. And I really am looking forward to talking about something that is very definitely near and dear to my heart right now.
Yeah, definitely. We're excited to have you. I know when I was looking over things, a lot of the points of focus that you wanted to hit on were in sync with a lot of what I was gearing up for as well. So just kind of in general, your experience with Unity, our current political environment, and ways to move forward in the environment we find ourselves in now, and obviously probably trying to weave a little bit of meditation practice and the values there throughout all of it. So I don't know, I guess we'll just first get started with your path to Unity. What interested you? What brought you to the Unity movement?
So probably the best place to begin is going back for a few years. I had followed both Brett and Eric Weinstein, and am familiar a little bit with kind of how they thought. I'm familiar with the incident that Brett had to endure at Evergreen, and that's probably where I was first made aware of both of them. And so I'd been following them for years, and obviously at some point Brett began to talk a little bit about the Unity movement. And it sounded very intriguing to me, and it resonated with me. It felt very spot on to what I was perceiving that was happening in the country. It just seemed like we were headed in a very dangerous and polarized direction. And unfortunately, I believe that was by design. It was not an accident that things started to spin out of control. And it's not an accident that we've arrived at where we are right now with a deeply, deeply divided country. I think there were a lot of things that were done, some unintentional, some intentional, unfortunately, that have gotten us to this point. So having had a very similar view of what was going on in our society, more broadly speaking. When Brett started talking about Unity, it just made a lot of sense to me. And so I decided to, despite generally being a very apolitical person and not really ever prior to this point being involved in a political movement, I decided to kind of dip my toe in the water and see what was going on there.
Yeah, that's actually not too terribly dissimilar from my own experience, including the apolitical tone. I've followed politics most of my adult life, but especially in the last few years, have kind of recognized the mental health gains of not letting it, inhabit all the areas of my life,
Sure.
So this seemed to kind of pull me out in an optimistic way, or at least just a clear-headed way, even though it was kind of a Hail Mary sort of situation. Going into that helped to kind of mitigate some of the expectations, but it helped to know that I was, behind the message and the spirit of the movement was something that felt like it encapsulated a much bigger piece of the pie of addressing the problems that we're facing as a country.
Yeah. I too recognize this as Hail Mary. And, first thing when I started dipping my toes in the water and hanging out in the Slack channel, I started to ask the question, okay, how realistic are expectations here? Because, if you took what Brett was talking about at face value, he certainly was articulating a vision where we would get on the ballot in all 50 states and, at least have a decent chance of making a good run at it. For me, I viewed that as a really, really long shot. Hail Mary doesn't quite capture it. And so when I started talking to people, either verbally or through the Slack, I just wanted to find out whether or not people had realistic expectations. And I was very happy to learn that nobody was, drinking the Kool-Aid, and they really understood that, yeah, this is probably not going to happen. And I was okay with that. So, the first benchmark, if you will, as to whether or not I wanted to go deeper than simply dipping my toes in the water was, okay, are people's expectations realistic? And the answer was universally yes. Everybody said, yeah, look, we understand that this is going to be very difficult.
Yeah.
And so that encouraged me to get involved even more. So what I would say is I first probably started in the Slack channel around early July, but I was just sort of like, take a step back and just kind of watch and see what's going on. It also is true that I'm not a very technical person, so I've never been on a Slack channel before. I think I'd been on a Discord server once before. So, I was sort of also kind of just feeling my way around, just understanding how the software works and, what the kit is. But I had enough confidence that people were realistic to start really kind of getting involved. And I think I would have started to pick up my activity in the Slack channel and then ultimately in the movement, probably late July, early August, maybe the first week of August at the latest.
Yeah. Yeah. I found it helpful to kind of, take a broad view for a bit and find out the currents in the stream, I guess, so to speak, of where I'm going to fit in the best, and ultimately ended up here. What were some of the? I know you hosted or were involved in some of the Campfire S'mores. Any other kind of highlights or roles that were part of your experience?
No, the S'mores was it. I at the beginning of August was asked to host after every campfire, the Campfire S'mores. And again, I don't know much about technology, so I was a little bit nervous, and I certainly, didn't know anything about facilitating conversations. And so this was all new, but I decided to do it anyway, because, again, I kind of understood the very deep need for what the movement is trying to accomplish. And so I had the opportunity to host the S'mores conversations, and they were wonderful. They typically would go at least 3 hours. Some of them went 3.5 hours. They were free-flowing conversations. I purposely tried to not add very much structure to them. Just my role in hosting the S'mores was to facilitate conversations, getting them going. But to be honest, it really didn't even need that much. People generally had a lot to say, and it was just wonderful. The conversations, with no single exception, And I don't know how many cumulative hours we ended up totaling, but there was not one single exception where somebody was disrespectful to somebody else. Not once, which is amazing, right? You know, given what's going on more broadly in society. And what was really cool is it was very clear that there was a whole broad spectrum of people with different political views. There was definitely one person I'm thinking of in particular was pretty far left. And then somebody who was a self-described evangelical Christian, I think actually from Ohio, as it turns out. And what was wonderful is they were very, very respectful to each other. There was no animosity, there was no hostility. One person would give their opinion, the other person would listen very, very respectfully, and then state their own opinion without any vitriol whatsoever. And so that my experience is hosting those conversations, in a sense, was almost a proof of concept, right? You know, this is possible. It is possible for humans to, disagree completely in some instances and still remember our common humanity and remember at the end of the day, we're all better off, if we cooperate with each other and we don't vilify somebody just because they're, quote, the other.
Yeah. Well, and I think it ties into what you were saying before of the realistic expectations, because it feels like within the group, even though, I mean, there were some surprisingly extreme views that were within the movement. I even noticed, and a few times was a little bit surprised to see it, but again, it was always welcome and it was always respectful. But I think again, to hammer home that point of starting out from an acceptance of reality as it is, even if it's not convenient at any point in time, or it's not always, the most comfortable position to hold. We were always in this knowing that it was a long shot, and we didn't take an all or nothing approach, because effectively the move, like our attempt to win the presidency in 2020 was if viewed through an all or nothing lens, was a nothing. And we all kind of knew that, but still it was working towards setting up a platform for that open communication, and respectful dialogue, again, given that we all started from the same kind of starting point.
Yeah, the way I thought about it is, again, it was extremely unlikely that, in my view, that we were even going to get on the ballot. But I think you sort of needed the motivation or the urgency, if you will, of the election to really kind of get people to pay attention. And so I think, from my perspective at least, that it was a good idea to do it in the way that it was done, because I think you attracted a lot of people in a way that wouldn't be there if you didn't have the immediacy of an upcoming election. And again, the other really clear proof of concept, when we look at the final numbers that Trump got something like 73 to 74 million votes. And I don't know what Joe Biden's final total was, but 81, 82 million. That's a deep, deep divide, right?
Yeah.
That's a lot of people that just had a completely opposite view of the other candidate. And it's just indicative of how strongly divided the country is. And again, I think it just sort of is really strong evidence that where this movement will hopefully go in the future is really, really needed. So I think that's really important to just understand that people were realistic and people knew that having this catalyst of the election was going to attract more people. But we also knew that the day after the election was when the movement in a real sense was really going to get started. Yeah. So I think those were very excellent points.
Yeah, definitely. And it is exciting moving forward. I think one of the things that captivated me was just a very, very firm grounding on the idea that there are problems about the situation that we as a nation are in right now, that are not easily dividable along party lines, that people are being affected by the same thing, that goes beyond party affiliation. A lot of people are aching in a lot of different ways, and the spirit of the movement was that neither party has really much interest in actually speaking to those universal broad problems, and instead maybe focusing and ramping up how it's covered or twisted into only being partisan issues.
There is a really good quote that I came across, and unfortunately, I don't remember who gave it, but it just in the last couple of days in social media, it was on Twitter. Somebody said that people should ask themselves whether or not they have more in common with the person on the other side of the political divide than they do with their political leaders. And I think that's right. I thought that was very, very perceptive. And obviously what that question is driving at is to really get people to ask and be reflective of, okay, again, if I'm on the political right or if I'm on the political left, do I really have more in common with that person than I do with people that are representing my side, if you will, in Washington right now? And I think the true answer is yes, I do have more in common with other people, even if I disagree with them in a lot of ways politically.
Yeah.
The other point that you made is really, really super important. And that's probably part of the reason, too, why I got involved in this movement. And that is, it's just really clear to me that whatever problem that you're looking at, sometimes the political left solution to the problem will be the best one. Sometimes the solution that's offered by the political right will be the optimal. And then other ones, a little bit of both. I'm a bit of a philosophy nerd, and I love John Stuart Mill. And when he talks about in On Liberty, he talks about free speech in chapter 2, and basically says, look, the reason that you want to have respectful dialogue and conversation with people that you don't agree with is you could be wrong and they could be right. You could be right and they can be wrong, but you can learn something from their position. And then the third one is you both might be right and wrong. And it just, that was written in the 19th century and he got it right.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The analogy I always use is like an archaeological dig kind of, or just, if we're looking at one thing, we might be looking at the same thing, but it's impossible for two people, no matter how closely they might be aligned, to truly see something exactly the same way, even if they take the same angle. Just their points of reference, the things they will notice that will pop out to them is going to be completely different. And what we would hope, I would think, is to collaborate in a way and create an atmosphere where your perspective gets added to mine. And we all, if we work together, enough people, that's, we're uncovering more and more of this, picture of reality or truth as it is. It's always incomplete, but we can't really hope to expand that if we're going to be exclusive to, or if we're going to exclude people's perspectives willy-nilly. It's a difficult process it's setting a cap for the upper bounds of how high a resolution you're willing to accept. I don't know. It's really interesting to me because it does just feel like we should be trying to superimpose and add all of these together, and join them to make the most sense of everything.
I just absolutely love that point. And I've been involved with another group, and we've been having conversations exactly along those lines. And I explained or tried to illustrate the point that you just made by using something that I learned from one of my intellectual heroes. It's a professor at Stanford University of Biology. He actually teaches what's called behavioral biology. His name's Robert Sapolsky. And what's really cool is that he in his lectures, and he puts all his lecture, or I shouldn't say he put all his lectures, he put a whole lecture series one year online on Introduction to Behavioral Biology. But what he does is super sophisticated in that a lot of the lectures actually weave in epistemology. And he's doing it intentionally because a lot of times people make epistemological errors. They just don't understand certain ways of viewing reality. And I bring that up because in one of the lectures, he talks about the reasons why the rooster crossed the road. And there's a hen on the other side of the road. And he brings up the point that, well, from the perspective of an evolutionary biologist, roosters that didn't cross the road had their genetic lineage die out. Okay, and that's a perfectly valid answer. Well, from an endocrinologist's point of view, well, the hormones in the male rooster were doing this, and the hormones in the female rooster were doing that, and he crossed the road for that reason, to procreate. And then from the perspective of an anatomist, well, there was these electrical signals that came to the brain that signaled the muscles that fired in a particular sequence that interacted with the skeleton and the joints, et cetera, et cetera. The point he's making is all three are entirely valid. Mm-hmm. None is no more right than the other. And so that's just exactly what you were speaking to a moment ago, which is that it's possible for me to look at something, I can be an endocrinologist and you can be an anatomist, and we're both right.
And viewing the same process.
Right, one's not more right than the other. And that's exactly why I brought up John Stuart Mill, because he was kind of driving at that point, which is that if you really want to have the most comprehensive view of reality, there are all these valid perspectives, and in some cases, they're not exclusionary. So that's why I just love that. I just love that point. And it's, as I said, in another group that I'm involved with, I'm trying to get them to understand that, because it's really, I think it's really critical.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think that was something that was captured within the Unity movement in terms of, I think you highlighted it as well with the s'mores. Just the level of respect, or just the willingness to come in and engage, in a humane way, and just, I would imagine, I personally missed all of those, but I would imagine there was, it sounds like it was most likely fueled by a lot of intellectual curiosity, mm-hmm. and openness to hearing other sides again, a non-exclusionary kind of framework going in.
What the other thing too is, and you're spot on. So I found, as a general rule, people to be very curious. And that is, as I've gotten older, a characteristic that I think is increasingly important. Because if you're curious, it's easier for you to understand what somebody else is thinking. If you've already figured it out, I've got all the answers, then I don't need to listen to you, right? And that's just a form of delusion. Mm-hmm. Nobody is that smart that they've got everything figured out. Even if you have a really, really high IQ, the actual reality of the world is so complicated that you can't possibly know everything there is to know about everything. And so, what you're talking to is really, really important. And it was just one of the really nice things that I experienced as part of Unity generally, but also the s'mores. But there was another aspect besides intellectual curiosity that was very, very clear to me, which is that it was, I would call it liberating for people to just be able to be themselves, speak their mind clearly, and know that it will be received respectfully and not judged harshly. And there were so many times where not just the way people would express, how this feels so great, it's wonderful to be able to have these conversations, to not feel like I'm walking on eggshells, but you could also see it in their face, right? Mm-hmm. Because I do think that there's something that is very beneficial to the human mind to just be yourself, without, again, just being always on guard. Oh, yeah, I can say something that person finds offensive. Okay, I'm going to not say that because it might offend them. And there's something that just doesn't feel quite right to doing that. And so, again, just over and over again in the course of those conversations, in the Campfire S'mores, and also the other events, we saw that over and over again. Just people were like, "Oh, thank goodness! I'm so glad that I've got an outlet to be able to express myself and not worry about what other people are going to think necessarily."
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important. It almost kind of slipped my mind to even, have to point this out at this point, but there was also an element there. I mean, the Unity movement was born amid the pandemic. So there was also the social kind of isolation that all of us were feeling to some extent or another. That having that community open up and the space to communicate that is maybe a little more closely aligned with maybe an in-person interaction where there's generally in person we tend to kind of mitigate some of that extra, or we're able to forego the rage instinct that comes on online when we have that boundary to effectively hide behind. But opening it up in this case and making yourself vulnerable in sharing ideas that, with a bunch of strangers, effectively, obviously over time you're building rapport and relationships there. But to an extent, you're always putting yourself out there. That's a scary thing, and facing that is something that is, the risk reward there is through the roof.
I think that's, in my view, one of the keys to the success of the movement going forward. Obviously, the challenge that we face is how do you scale this, right? And it doesn't look like there's a simple way, at least that I can identify. And I'm not aware that anybody else within the movement has identified. And so personally, the way I think about it is that we have to start on very small scales. And part of the most important first element, if you will, is to start to create a culture that is exactly consistent with what you just described. And it's not something that you can just say, but it's something that you have to model, right? So to the extent that we can figure out how to get people to participate and they witness this sort of culture where it's just very liberating, where people who express themselves and use the words in a vulnerable way, and I think that's a great way of describing it, are rewarded for that, not punished. I think that is something that can help the movement grow. When people witness that, they'll realize that that's so much better an alternative than that which is available generally in the rest of society.
Yeah.
And that's particularly true, obviously with what's going on in social media, because social media typically is the opposite of that, right? Twitter seems to have degenerated into, it's just an excuse to just go after somebody that, at least in some instances, is expressing just a very well thought out view, very heartfelt view. And then some people just want to attack like the piranha. And so I think one of the things that this movement can do is model the opposite. And when people get to experience that, it's just so clear, just from a psychological point of view, that that's such a better alternative.
Yeah. Yeah. It also, I mean, it seems to kind of go against human nature to it's not like we're saying it's obvious in every, moment or choice that we have to make that it's a better decision to, interview someone whose views are in alignment with mine. It's not always obvious that it might be better to actively seek out disagreement and find a way to do that. So, I mean, I think that also is just, it's kind of counterintuitive. And it doesn't feel like it will be as fruitful as it oftentimes is if both parties approach it with the same kind of good faith operation. But yeah, that expansive potential there of the relationships, as opposed to with how easy it is, echo chambers and all that. It's very easy, and it plays on human nature to kind of do that, to suck us in, and it is a comforting feeling to have, but growth tends to not do so well in overly comfortable environments. So creating a structure that healthily challenges or pushes people into situations that allow them to almost force them to inhabit space that they're not used to inhabiting, but in a safe and supportive way, again, offers so much potential for growth and just recognizing what that experience is like, so that that model might imprint a little bit more firmly within that individual.
Yeah, I think that also is just spot on. One of my favorite aphorisms is asking the question, what's the most important book on your bookshelf? And the answer is the one you haven't read. And I just love that, because that's really what your comments were pointing to. It's that we as humans have to start to develop that kind of attitude towards uncertainty and what we don't know. Mm-hmm. And you're 100% correct. I happen to be a fan of a certain neuroscientist by the name of Bolato. And what he talks about in his book, he really talks about the fact that humans actually hate uncertainty. Absolutely hate uncertainty, and hate uncertainty to the point where you would rather do something that's comfortable but familiar, even when your brain is starting to recognize it doesn't really work. And so part of the challenge that we face just broadly in society, and as part of this movement, is to counteract that human instinct to be aversive towards uncertainty. Bolato's book is called Deviate, by the way. I should
okay, great. Yeah.
Yeah. And anyway, again, I think this neuroscience is 100% correct. We just generally don't like things that we just don't understand. Yet you have to go into that uncomfortable place to grow and to progress. In order to be able to deal with that uncertainty, you have to have a feeling of safety. And then again, this is really Bolato. He said, look, I get it. We're all hardwired to avoid uncertainty, but we need to do it to, make things better and to understand what's going on. And in order to do that, we have to have a feeling of safety. And in this context, what we're talking about safety is what we're talking about has occurred in the Unity movement thus far.
That's a great.
You can say. I have no idea what your political beliefs are, but I am getting a sense that you're a typical Unity person, and that you can tell me what you think politically, and I'm just going to say, okay, that's good, and maybe I agree with that, or maybe I don't, but that's okay. But again, that's the culture that lays the foundation for making improvement.
Yeah, absolutely.
Otherwise, what happens, and I've witnessed this in other organizations I've been involved with, is people won't say their opinion when there's a lot of other people listening. I'll have a conversation with them one-on-one, and they'll be very clear as to what their opinion is. We'll move into a group setting in a meeting, for example. The topic will come up, and I'll just sit there and watch them not say a word, because they're afraid that they will upset the tribe. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they even are worse than that. They'll say the opposite of what they said in private, because they think that they're saying something in public what the rest of people want to hear. And the problem with that, of course, is some people will be aware that they have either the opposite opinion or they have an opinion that's unstated. And then they'll be like, oh, well, okay, can I really trust that person if they're withholding information, or if, in some instances, actually saying things that are the opposite of what they really believe? And so you start to create that culture that is a little bit unsafe in the sense that, oh, I can't really trust that person. And so you can't have those really candid conversations. It just inhibits understanding and slows down progress. There's just no question about that. And the good news is Unity seems to get that's the problem, and seems to be pretty good at counteracting it.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like, that's such a great way to put it. It feels like there's so many different manifestations of that fear-driven response, which, the discomfort plays into the same thing. And it's, this will be a quick pivot to the meditation realm, but
Right.
craving and aversion, it's there,
Right.
the broad scale dichotomy there. Like we're stuck with one or the other. We either want something and we act in a way that seeks to make that a reality, or we don't want something and we act in a way as if to brace for what we expect a bad outcome to be. And yeah, it acting, there's an effect that like we all are in this together. We are responsible for supporting as a country, and that divide, that hard divide of 70 whatever million versus 80 whatever million, that still doesn't account for everybody, but there is this sense, and you can even take it globally, like everybody is supporting the reality that we all live in at any given point in time, and that person kind of telling lies or within certain contexts betraying their own sort of viewpoint is, it just kind of, if enough people start doing that, we're kind of escaping out of that reliability of what this reality is. If there's multiple layers happening at one point in time with any given individual, it's easy to see how once that scales, how much chaos is injected into an already chaotic and complex system.
I really think that there's really two really good points there. I want to, if you don't mind, I'll focus on the latter, and then we can circle back down to practice.
Sure.
But you just made a really profound point in my view, which is, again, the way that society can cohese is if we have a certain minimum level of trust. And without going too geeky, there's a really good theory that is taught in economics, game theory. And just in short, what game theory says is that there are clearly optimal outcomes, clearly suboptimal outcomes, and outcomes that in some instances are just the worst for everybody. But under certain circumstances, you can only achieve the optimal outcomes if people trust each other, right? And you're pretty much guaranteed to achieve the suboptimal. And in situations where trust is almost non-existent, you're guaranteed to get the worst for everybody. That's effectively what game theory is saying. And it's true. As I was joking with a friend of mine, you go to university and they teach you all these theories, especially in the social sciences, and 80% of them don't map onto reality very well. This happens to be one that maps onto reality perfectly. It really does. It really, really does. And the best way to describe it is if we have one of the games is called the Tragedy of the Commons, and if we have a common resource, and the best way to think about it is, imagine there's just 10 people living around a lake, and as long as you extract no more than a certain number of fish per year, the lake population of fish is sustainable. But unfortunately, there's an incentive for one person to do more than their allotment, and because they can get ahead, right? They can get 50% more than the allotment that's stable for the whole lake, and so there's a temptation to do that, and then they'll do that, and they'll get ahead, and then somebody else will notice that they did that and get ahead, and then they'll start to cheat, and that's how you end up completely destroying the lake's fish population. It gets overfished. That is actually reality in terms of how the world works in those circumstances where there's a shared resource. So again, the sustainability occurs if and only if people have a high degree of trust. And the fact of the matter is you can have a regulatory framework that you put over the lake, and so you have somebody, from the Department of Fish and Game that goes around the lake and tries to make sure people all have their permits and aren't overfishing. But there's holes in that, obviously. And so the real enforcement mechanism has to be a cohesive trust. And when it breaks down, all of society breaks down. And so I think that's some of what you're driving at.
Yeah.
The other thing that you brought up really has to do with kind of a mindfulness practice. And you talked a little bit about aversion and wanting is the way that some of it is described in the practices. And it's true. There's this notion that people just generally want things to be a certain way that is actually other than what it really is. And so, great example, again, to circle back around to the neuroscience, people want answers to things that are inherently uncertain. They want to say, no, this is the answer, right? And I'm sure of it. And I just had an experience where a teacher recently said something where they were just so sure, no, this is how it is. I was actually kind of surprised because no. And again, I wasn't saying that they were wrong, but they were wrong in saying that they're absolutely sure this was the answer. And again, It was just human. That's, to use some of the teachings. It's not a problem in the sense that that's how our brains are designed to work through thousands and thousands of years of evolution. This fear of uncertainty is literally hardwired into our brain. This idea of wanting things to be other than they actually are, again, just hardwired into our brain. And so what's helpful, I think, from a meditation perspective is it teaches you to notice that your brain has those tendencies. And simply by virtue of noticing that you have those tendencies, you reduce them. Just by, now I'm seeing that I want things to be different than they actually are. And that just recognition helps you, proportionally reduce the time that you're confused and not able to see things as they actually are. The other thing you also mentioned, obviously the meditation practice does emphasize interconnectedness, right? And effectively, it's just we're all in this together. And again, there's hardwired into the brain a certain level of self-interest. It has to. Right. We have to, at least to some degree, have to look out for ourselves. We have to feed ourselves. We have to make sure we get enough rest. And when we get sick, we have to take care of ourselves. All that is natural. There's nothing wrong with that. But self-interest can slide into greed in the extreme. And again, to emphasize the opposite of, yes, it's okay to be self-interest, but recognizing that my behavior, my moral actions, my speech affects you, and the way your body language and what you say and your ethics affects me. So right now there's this feedback loop, and again, there's very, very good neuroscience, right? There's mirror neurons, and we're subconsciously just reacting to each other. So the second thing is that you mentioned is interconnectedness, and to remind people that whether we like it or not, we're in this together. And if we can recognize that and improve upon the proportion of time we're cognizant of that, it creates the safety that benefits everybody at the same time.
Yeah, well, I think expanding that interconnectedness idea even further, it's like we are as humans interconnected, but it's not even, you can extend it beyond that. And I think it's actually helpful. And through this process, I've sat 2 10-day Vipassana retreats. So it's like still very, very early on, but there is part of that experience for me that forced me to sit with seemingly very counterintuitive or contrary things. So I think that interconnectedness, like that energy, recognizing that extends all the way up. There's that wanting and the aversion. Those are connected. Those are parts of the same thing. And we can ride it all the way to one extreme, but just as easily take it the other way. And the negation of one is essentially the definition of they go hand in hand. And there's weird contours that get introduced when even bringing it back into politics, as much as I hate to do this, there was definitely a sense that we've been in probably a cycle for several election cycles now where people vote less for someone than they do against a person. And there is, I think, again, having the experience with the meditative practice of recognizing, aversion is kind of just bracing for something that I don't want, which is a negation on the other thing, which is just as slippery of a slope to go down.
Correct.
I can easily slide into being attached to and getting stuck in the feedback loop of what I do want. And it's that interconnectedness extends out all the way there. And I think there's, again, the value comes in holding space for all of it and not just part of it. And we're so quick to filter out. Again, going back to that exclusionary principle of if we keep things out, then our echo chambers are making our reality seem like it is only half of the picture. And so we're in the dark on these other issues, or don't recognize how our patterns in our own minds play out based on the same principles that we seem to be fighting against, or however you want to put it. It's
that's another really, really good point. So in the meditation practice, the language is called don't know mind, right? And you're, in effect, what you're describing is we need to cultivate don't know mind. And again, it's just that's our brain is designed to work by confusing us into believing that we know something that we can't know. There was a really good evolutionary reason for that. And, the way it's often described is, if it's 100,000 years ago and we're in a savanna in Africa and we come up on a bush and there's some sound coming from that bush, we don't sit there and think about, oh, I wonder what that is. Is it, some little animal or is it a predator? We just turn around and get out. And then we convince ourselves that was absolutely the right thing to do, even though we don't know for sure. And again, so it had a very good purpose in terms of preserving life in those circumstances. But today, in dealing with an incredibly complicated world, where our society is really super complex, where, if you really want to understand human behavior, it too, in and of itself, is super complex. That doesn't work. You can do the shortcuts and you can convince yourself that, oh yeah, well, I know why he said that. I know why he did that. You actually really don't, because there's just so much going on there. And so this idea in the practice of just thinking about, okay, I need to really, in a deep way, understand that I know less than I think I do. Right. And there's very, very good research. And how it applies to the political world is exactly the way you just described, which is that, okay, we all, to one degree or another, have filter bubbles. And so if you're on the left, you tend to get your news from maybe MSNBC, maybe the New York Times, and they're going to filter it in a very specific way. And if you're on the right, maybe you get your news from the Washington Examiner or Fox News, and they're going to filter the information in a very, very specific way. And then we tend to self-segregate as well, too. So our social circle, where we live and the people we interact with on a social basis, sometimes and maybe often just have the same political views. And so it just all becomes a very self-reinforcing cycle on both sides. And so this concept of trying to remind people that you should have humility, which is another way of saying don't know mind,
Yeah.
is potentially a way to help break through that. And as I've gotten older, I'm very, very careful about asking myself, okay, if my views aren't deviating from a certain political perspective, the odds are I'm probably getting something really wrong, right?
Or at least missing something.
No, I think the odds are pretty good that you got something wrong. I really do. I did it because again, in college we used to have these debates because I actually did think about majoring in philosophy. Ended up not doing.
I did.
Oh, good for you. Good for you. I regret it, by the way. But we used to have these really rich discussions, and one of them I remember vividly. I went to UCLA. I remember vividly my freshman year in the dorms, we'd go out in the lounge and we'd start having this back and forth, and it was fun. And one of the things that would always come up is religion. And the truth is that there was a group of us that would mock another group who were just so sure that theirs was the one true religion. Right?
Yeah.
And then you just like, okay, but that person over there, they're a different religion and they're saying the same thing. And you can't both, in some instances, you can't both be right. There's some mutually exclusive beliefs embedded in your system. So you can't both be right. Same thing with the politics, right? There's a lot of discussion in the intellectual circles about, is politics today a new religion? And in a certain sense, I think that's right. In the sense that, people just line up in a certain set of beliefs that in a certain respect are just dictated from out there, right? And you just take them on, and then you start to personalize them, and you're sure your side is right and the other one's wrong, and they're equally sure that they're right and you're wrong. And again, to me, that's just, to use the meditation language, it's just delusion, right?
Yeah. Well, I think you just very successfully summed up my years-long path from religious upbringing or just my own personal religious beliefs to being like, well, either all of them are right or none of them are right. And the level of certainty that all of them think that they're right is the thing that's standing out to me. Yeah. And but then I feel like I took it to the other extreme where I was pretty certain that they were all wrong.
Right.
And at this point, I'm just kind of like, who's to say? I am definitely the only thing I know for certain is that I have no clue whatsoever. Right. And that's, again, that humility aspect comes in. And then also, like, once you can accept that humility and it's coming from a genuine place, you'll find that you're equipped with tremendous amount of curiosity, which is, again, one of those qualities that we were talking about touching on earlier. And I think that's, again, bringing it all back in. There's a very tremendous power in recognizing and accepting and embracing the unknown in every, every situation you're going into, because you can adopt a mindset that I'm willing to learn something new here, or I'm not. And we tend to have better, the interactions of people who are open to learning new things tend to be a lot more interesting.
Yeah, the problem with religious dogma and political dogma is you're cultivating a mindset that you have all the answers, right? It's okay, my side, we believe in these things, and they are the true, absolute answers to reality, and your brain is just shut down. And again, it plays into this whole notion that we're hardwired to despise uncertainty. So it plays into that. And so you can't learn anything, right? Not to pick on religions, but and I actually went to Sunday school when I was a young kid, a Calvinist tradition. And so they used the King James Version of the Bible. And so you didn't need to figure anything out. All you had to do is read the Bible, and it gave you the answers. And that was the absolute truth. I mean, I was very explicitly taught that way. And so, in a sense, that shuts down attempting to understand somebody who might have a different religion, right?
Or even a different interpretation of the same Bible.
That's exactly right. And so, I again really appreciate what you just said, which is that part of the challenge that we face as part of this movement is that's the reality of how people think. Whether you're talking about religion or whether you're talking about politics, is they have a confused view that the comfort of knowing that their side has all the answers is serving them well. It's actually not, right? And it's not serving the collective well. And so the challenge of this movement, and it's not an easy problem to solve, is how do you break through that mentality? How do you break the duopoly, right? Because the duopoly serves that purpose. The second thing I would say is, and I think you touched on it in your comments earlier, is we're voting against the other person more often than not for the person that we voted for. And I actually think that's by design. I do think that part of the reason that we have arrived at this hyperpolarized position in society today is the politicians were doing that on purpose. And again, I'll use kind of meditation practice, but also just neuroscience, which is, again, there's a part of your brain that's hardwired for reactivity. It's called the amygdala. It's the fight or flight part of your brain. And I think it started probably inadvertently, but now it's intentional. Politicians from both sides know that you can hack somebody's brain by appealing to their fear and appealing to their anger. At the same time, there's a very, very clear analysis of what's gone on in traditional media, which effectively has them arriving at exactly the same place, where they realize, if you're a major newspaper, that if they play to your fear and they play to your anger, their subscriber numbers will be higher than would be the case otherwise. And then just for extra special fun, we have social media. Their algorithms explicitly are trying to get people excited, either angry or fearful. So you have all that confluence of events. You have politicians doing it on purpose. You have the media doing it on purpose. And you have social media doing it on purpose. It's not surprising that what results is hyperpolarization and massive distrust. One thing that's probably worth mentioning is a lot of conversations that I participated in during the summer and into fall involved, are we really headed towards a civil war? And I have to admit that, when I started kind of in July and August, I thought, okay, I respect the argument a lot. I hear why people would take that position. It just felt a little bit too hyperbolic. I was wrong. They were right. Yeah. They were absolutely 100% correct. What happened in the Capitol, for me, having had that experience with the Unity discussions, didn't surprise me in the least.
Yeah.
Not even a little bit. Go ahead.
You definitely. Well, yeah. I was just going to say they're definitely not wrong in the sense that this is something worth being concerned about and worrying about. And yeah, I definitely had that. Just kind of we a few of us on the team here actually had taken a few weeks intentional time away from things, and we're gearing up for an episode with the three hosts where Toby was going to fill Eric and I in on what had happened. And in the time we planned that episode, in between that and when we actually shot, that was the Capitol storming. And it just, Eric and I, who had been blissfully unaware for the holiday season, were both just sucked back in, and just a lot of like grave feelings of just kind of like pits in my stomach. Is this actually how is this actually happening? And
I think if you accept my premise that politicians have been playing on fear and anger for years,
I wanted to ask, with that, were you is that based on, or is that a thought or a belief that everyone that was a coordinated effort, or just at the individual level playing up, or at least maybe how that started, or maybe the timeline of where you're thinking that?
I think it works, right? And I don't know exactly where the crossover occurred. It's been building, in my view, for over a decade, that
Oh yeah.
accidentally, I think politicians started to notice that if they got somebody angry, again, the goal wasn't so much to get somebody to like you, it was to get you to dislike the other person. And because we've got this part of our brain, the amygdala, that's about flight or fight, it's much easier to do, right? It's easier for me to say something that you hate than to get you to like me, right?
Yeah.
And so somewhere along the line, and it goes back well before a decade, but I've noticed it more definitely in the last 10 years, where they started to be just much more intentional. And it works. It works because, again, if I can get you to hate the other person, that's the best path to get you to vote for me. And they figured that out. And then again, at the same time, and this is what's so horrible, the same time, the traditional way of doing business in traditional media started to break down. And somebody wrote a really, really good essay, and they were picking on the New York Times, and they were right, where they very clearly discussed, look, what happened was, the internet definitely disrupted their traditional model. And the significance is that right now on my tablet or my phone, I can get the what happened, just the pure reporting, just the facts, way faster than the New York Times ever can get it to me, right? Mm-hmm. The next edition of the New York Times isn't going to be published until tomorrow morning. Meanwhile, I can get alerts on my phone immediately, just the what, right? And so what happened effectively is they, to a very important degree, were disintermediated from the just fact gathering and letting people know what happened. So what's left for them? It has to start to increase the proportion of their business that's about opinion. Has to.
Yeah. Right. Well, and the proliferation of the tool of putting that in everyone's pocket. Essentially, now they're also competing in a much different sphere of
right,
competing for attention and engagement. And then you look for ways of capitalizing that.
Yeah. So the point I was just simply going to make was that they can't compete with just the raw data feed of just what happened, right? Whatever the football score is right now, I can just look it up. Whether the Tampa Bay Buccaneers beat the
box scores exist for a reason. Yeah.
I'll just be able to pull it up. So they can no longer compete in that way. So they had to adjust their business model to opinion. Now, once you go to opinion, you got to take a side, right? You're either going to go left or right, and they went left, and that worked too, right? Because there are who knows how many 70 plus million, 80 million Democrats in the country. And if they get 10 million, 15 million regular readers, they make a lot of money. So they went left, Fox went right, and that's just how everything bifurcated. So now the business model is less about news, but more about opinion, and specifically catering to, if you're on the New York Times, the left. If you're on the Washington Examiner, you're on the right. And they just start catering to that. And at the same time, again, just hacking the amygdala and getting people angry and fearful, that gets people's attention above, as you point out, there are just so many more sources now. So how do I get heard above all the rest of the sources? Well, I scare people. I'll frame a story. I'll use language that makes the story as scary as possible. Or I'll frame the story in a way that makes people as angry as possible. And so that's exactly what's happened on the traditional media side. Social media, again, the algorithms are explicit about trying to do that. And the politicians figured out, if I get you to hate the other person, then you're going to vote for me. surprise, surprise, we're hyperpolarized, and I think those are the causes and conditions that lead to what we witnessed in the Capitol. Just a bunch of people that were manipulated into just being incredibly angry and incredibly scared too. And so, of course, once the amygdala takes over, and again, the neuroscience is that you don't give your amygdala permission to take over; it just takes over, right? Yeah. If somebody does something and you get angry, it's in charge. And so they, in a very real sense, were manipulated. But then the left is manipulating its constituency as well too. There's really no difference. Yeah. Our job in Unity, I believe, is to figure out a way to counteract that.
Yeah. No, I think that's
to stop it.
Totally
and to get people to understand that this is what's happening, and that it doesn't, in the long term, serve their purpose.
Yeah. When I guess the one thing that brings me back to, again, the meditative practice is an antidote for all of this is more self-reflection, and again, sometimes that's participating in an event that is, you're going to be exposed to viewpoints that are unlike your own. So there's still a choice there to reflect on something bigger or beyond yourself, or whether that's the meditation is the cheapest tool that's available to literally everyone, literally right now, and it's hard to imagine. There's seemingly has been a growing trend of popularity of different forms of meditation, and I'm similar to how we talked about the religious beliefs kind of thing, religious structures of a mind where it's kind of there's probably a lot of good value in a bunch of them. There's also, it's hard to necessarily point a finger at any one tradition and say this is the only way to do it, but there's something about choosing to set aside these things that we're fed, constantly fed and like you said, manipulated into consuming, and so that we're constantly needing the next bit of news or information or whatever that is. And there's something about committing to some form of taking a break from that and looking within yourself, in some form or another. I think that, again, just all of this, the through line of it, a lot of these issues or problems is just some of it. It seems like there's been too many cycles over and over and over where people have not stopped to consider what it is they're taking part in.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. So the physiology of what goes on in your brain, especially with respect to the amygdala, again, it was designed for really, really good self-preservation reasons through evolutionary biology. Yeah, absolutely was important in helping the human species survive out in the wilderness. The problem is that in today's society, it's very maladaptive, right? The truth is that to a certain extent, we've created a society that's safe, by comparison, right? I can go walk.
Mostly safe.
But I'm on a relative basis, it's safe. I can go for an hour walk and I can be pretty confident that nothing bad's going to happen in my particular neighborhood right now, right? Again, it's not perfectly safe, but it's very different than, having to fight for life and death. Where am I going to, where am I going to get my next meal from? Where am I going to get the water from? And oh, by the way, I've got to avoid all the predators out there. It's different. So what I'm saying is that this reactive mind, to use the language, is what's being hacked.
Yeah.
And it's creating fear with respect to other people where it doesn't need to be there. And so our challenge is to figure out how to completely not completely, but as much as we can to counteract that. And once we do that, we can start having more respectful conversations, and we can bring the country together. But the challenge is that the way the amygdala works is it's like a muscle. And so what happens is the more your mind is exposed to fear or exposed to anger, the higher propensity it is to feel those emotions the next time and the next time and the next time.
Tolerance goes up.
So what happens is the neurotransmitter levels in that region of the brain are elevated relative to what they would be. The amygdala actually grows in size. Again, in that sense, it's like a muscle. So, if somebody's constantly on edge, they're constantly angry, and they're constantly fearful, it actually gets bigger. And the reach of the length and the reach of the amygdala into other parts of the brain actually grows longer. All three of those things, higher, bigger in size, higher neurochemical transmitters, and greater reach into the brain. So it's the physiological thing that happens when people are constantly on edge, either very frequently angry or very frequently scared. So what happens?
You get used to it.
It
becomes comfortable, and it becomes harder to even
physically.
Yeah.
Physically, there are biological changes that occur that make it harder for you to not get angry the next time. And the point I was making earlier is, oh my God, politicians have been purposely pushing people's buttons. So is the traditional media, and so is social media. So of course people are going to be more reactive and less responsive, to use the language of meditation, because those physical changes have occurred.
Yeah.
And it's not anybody's fault. There are physiological changes that are causing people to be more quick to anger. So again, it leads to where we are today, where people just are on the edge, very deeply mistrustful, and just assume the worst when they're talking to somebody else. Our challenge is to counteract that. Use the word antidote. We are an antidote, because again, what I started remarking about earlier is that in these conversations, whether they were the day of actions, or alternatively whether there's s'mores, people were not succumbing to that. And that started to create the positive feedback loop that was bringing down the temperature and actually creating physiological changes in the brain that reduce the propensity to react, as we say in meditation, unskillfully.
Yeah. Well, and I think the unseen thing there is that the more that cycles through, the more comfortable, the more familiar it becomes, the more that tolerance raises, and it makes we develop that attachment to that feeling if it grows, and that's what we're used to. If it repeats over and over and over and over again, and that's all we know, it's even more enticing to just stay there, because that there is that, again, to escape that would require you to step out of the familiar into the unknown, which is, again, we're back right at the very start of this all. That's not our strong suit. We're not wired that way.
It takes effort. It absolutely takes effort. And so, I think you said earlier, you've been on a couple 10-day retreats.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, you invested, the better part of 2 weeks of your life twice, right?
Yeah.
That's a big commitment. Yeah. And I'm going to hazard a guess that there were some periods of time that weren't easy.
Just right? A few.
Safe bet.
Just a few. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, in terms of the commitment of time, there's an opportunity cost. You could have been doing something else. And while you're there, I'm sure there were periods that were somewhat difficult, and which is, again, normal. Yeah. So that's not a small price to pay to try to counteract, what we're talking about. But I don't know that there's another method that works, and be persistent, right? And, just going on one a weekend, 3-day retreat, not enough. You have to do more of it. And so that's the challenge that we face.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said earlier, I think the answer is if we can just model that behavior and reach out to other people and get them to come and witness that behavior, they will at least see that this alternative is possible and that it is beneficial.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think taking the opportunity at times too, where this again feels counterintuitive, but maybe that's kind of the whole thing we should be aimed at. That's been my takeaway in the last few years, and what kind of pushed me in that direction to even attend the retreats, among other things, has been a pretty direct commitment to leaning into the uncomfortable aspects, because I was unhappy with things, how they were going. So I at a certain point you have to recognize that it's not going to change if I keep doing the same thing. So I think within my circles, it the more I did these things and pushed myself outside of the comfort zone, it felt strange in certain senses of just, I felt a little bit of a outside feeling in that sense. But again, I think, and again, there's recognition that taking 10 days of one's time is no small task. I think my personality pushes me to kind of jump in the deep end kind of with some of that stuff. It's not to say it's for everybody, but again, the fundamental aspect of this practice is that it doesn't cost anything but your time and attention. And so that was one thing that I guess motivated me to get into it, and recognizing that it's only as good as the work that I put in. And I mean, first to admit that the practice, I've maintained a very inconsistent practice outside of the retreats, but it's helpful to kind of know that that's there, and to know through experience that if I don't, show up and do it, I can't expect any really returns there.
Yeah.
And it is something, even a weekend retreat might not be enough to truly maybe reach it, but it's also, I don't want to be like to downplay that as well, because even at a certain point too, there's a way to kind of incorporate those lessons into brief little glimpses throughout the day and pepper them throughout, and that's just as effective or just as valuable, I guess, to be able to access that and at least recognize that in moments where you might feel your amygdala flare up, and yeah, we're still susceptible to it.
Yeah, that's right. This is really important. It's not that, if you accumulate X number of hours, you're going to be, how shall I say, in a completely liberated mind. That's not how your mind works. Rather, what happens is that I think it's a stair-step function. And so what ends up happening is you try to learn something like this, and it's just kind of flat. And then one day there's kind of like a stair-step, and then it's flat, 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 and then there's a stair-step. And those occur at indeterminate points in the future. Mm-hmm. So any little bit that you can do is helpful. And, again, just bringing it back to where we are as a society, what it ultimately is about is creating space between your thoughts and your actions. We cannot control our thoughts at all. Your brain is going to produce whatever thoughts it's producing.
Yep.
But what you can do is start to create space and say, okay, those are the thoughts, sort of like a Chiron that's just running through your head all the time. And you can just, okay, well, let me recognize them, and let me choose, by creating a little bit of space between the thoughts and my behaviors. Let me choose which one I think will be the most beneficial for not just myself, but everybody. And that's just not where we are as society, because to a certain degree, the culture has gone in the opposite direction, for all the reasons that I've described, and probably lots of them that I can't think of. And so I think our job in Unity is to be the antidote to that. And the way to be the antidote to that is to model the opposite behavior. It's unsatisfying. Every time I've said that.
It's definitely not sexy always.
Yeah, no, I've said it multiple times during the s'mores, and it's just unsatisfying. And I get it, because the need is urgent, right?
Yeah.
we are at risk of armed conflict. And we are at risk of heightened levels of violence. And I don't necessarily see the catalyst other than what we're trying to do on the immediate horizon. And so there is an urgency for sure. And so there's this desire to try to get it done quickly, but I just don't think that's how the human minds work. And I don't think cultures change that quickly. And so, a lot of my conversations, in the summer and into early fall were really about playing the long game.
Yeah.
I'm not aware that there's a shortcut.
Yeah.
And, I really appreciate, the scalability of social media. And if we hadn't gotten kicked off of Twitter, we would have had that. But I'm just joking, obviously, but, I think that was, obviously, we because of that urgency and because of the momentum and the immediacy of having an election, to use social media and to try and scale it as quickly as possible was right. But in my mind, this other long game that unfortunately takes just a lot of patience and a lot of persistence, where bit by bit, it's trying to figure out how to get people interested in just attending. And then hopefully they'll see the behaviors that actually do. Again, it's just, there were so many times people said, oh, I'm really appreciative of I just can speak and not get judged. When they see that, I think a lot of people will instinctively understand that that's a better way of being in the world. And what we're doing is we're trying to unhack the hacking that's occurring that's increasing the propensity for fear and anger. That's, to me, the long game that Unity can play.
Yeah.
And I think it'll ultimately work, but unfortunately, it's very unsatisfying because it takes so long.
Absolutely. And at no point in time along the way does it ever necessarily feel easy. I think, again, I'll make the assumption this time your way about using the stair-step kind of diagram. Within the meditation practice of having that kind of breakthrough moment, and then just chasing that, being attached to I just reached this new thing, this is great, this is working, and then that's all you could focus on, and it's just perpetually out of reach, so elusive the more you want to try to grab onto it. And so there's even that aspect within the movement of we want how do you effectively balance the progress that we're making while also not resting on that too much, or not getting so attached with the progress itself?
That's very spot on. So what we have, whether we're talking about progress in the Unity movement or progress in a meditation practice, we have a measurement problem. It's hard to measure. In fact, it's impossible to measure.
Yeah, and yet that's all we want to do.
So you're not getting the feedback loop that your brain wants,
mm-hmm.
right? And so I think what we're trying to do in the Unity movement is very audacious, which is we're effectively trying to see if we can reprogram culture.
Yeah.
In a country of 330 million people, and so it really is audacious. Right. But the challenge, of course, is, in my view, is that if we are successful, it's going to take a long time. I just don't know that there's a shortcut. And so along the way, it will seem like we're really not doing much. Again, just exactly like, what we're talking about with meditation. It just seems like it's a flat line. And just so you understand, when I talk about this stair-step function, it comes from somebody by the name of George Leonard, who wrote a book called Mastery. And effectively, what he was talking about, he was an Aikido teacher, and it just, his Aikido students had always had that pattern. He also described, like, learning how to play a musical instrument, for example. It all often feels the same way. Meditation feels the same way. Trying to change culture is going to feel the same way. It's going to feel like we're doing nothing, that we're making no progress. It'll seem like the number of people involved in Unity are just flatline. We're really not getting large numbers. We're not scaling, blah, blah, blah. So it'll be the flatline. And then at some indeterminate point in the future, if we're successful, we'll see a jump. And so the challenge that we have internally at Unity is to keep the patience and the persistence, and to be okay with that lack of positive feedback loop, and just understand that we just have to stay at it, stick with it. And if it's going to happen, it'll happen at some indeterminate point in the future.
Yeah. And it's almost by structuralizing the good behaviors and those habits that maybe it's expecting or looking for that reward behavior, or that reward from in the same space, in the same dimensions as what, maybe that first step was that came in. So we might be looking in that same area, but essentially those plateaus, or that kind of flatlining, can just feel very stagnant. Right. But it's, again, like committing to the practice of it. And in that case, it's, providing that space for open conversation, respectful dialogue, all of that, by embracing the mundane aspects of it and just continuing to stay committed to that. You hope, that's where the next stair step becomes apparent, and it probably won't come from the same place that your last stair step came from. It actually almost requires you to reach a level of automaticity in the practice to recognize novel things within that kind of stable set of behaviors.
Yeah, and it could just be you can't recognize it until after that stair step function occurs. And that's okay. And I tried not to be too evangelical, but that's what I was trying to the extent that I was trying to preach something during the s'mores, was exactly what we're talking about. Please be patient. Please recognize that it's going to look like we're not doing anything, but we actually are. And again, that's why I like the analogy to learning how to play a new instrument. It just, you feel like you're all thumbs, and it feels very awkward, and it just seems like it's, for those of us who aren't Jimi Hendrix, so I do try to fool around with an electric guitar. It just feels awkward, right? It's just like, I'm not getting it. I'm just not making progress. And, I just, practice and practice. And then, one day I try to play some. Oh, okay. I actually got that song almost right. Right? Yeah. And so you just do that, but you just have to fight through that first period. And again, why I think this book Mastery is very, very useful, because he recognizes that's how it is. And the reason more people don't learn how to play the instrument is because they don't get that feedback loop, and they just give up. And, to use the language, one of my favorite teachers, he loves to use the term comparing minds. So, we see somebody who has put in the hours, and, they look, it's so much easier for them. I'm an idiot. Why am I struggling as much as I can? So you start to just incorrectly believe that it was easier for that other person. And there, of course, are some prodigies who, of course, it was easier for them. But the reality is, all the 99% of the rest of us, the only difference that was between us and somebody else is those that gave up and those that didn't. And again, I think this is just really 100% analogous to what we're talking about in terms of Unity, which is that we've got to convince people to not expect real concrete results too soon. That's one of the really gigantic challenges, because people are going to naturally, I just doesn't, somebody who is really, I'm thinking of somebody who I won't name, but was really actively involved. And we had had conversations like, okay, this is a Hail Mary. It's not going to happen. We need to play the long game. Need to be patient, just along the lines of what we're talking about here. And, about a week after the election, he just like dropped away, typed something in Slack and said, oh, okay, I'm done. Again, it's just like, he didn't really, in a deep way, understand the message that was trying to be conveyed. He didn't get it. And so he dropped away. Again, in the analogy with playing an instrument, it was like, he tried to learn how to play an instrument for a few months and didn't see the progress, didn't get that feedback, and so he just dropped away. That's one of the huge challenges that we have, is to counter program that and get people comfortable with the idea that realistically the only way this is going to be successful is if we play the long game.
Absolutely. Well, Desmond, I think that's probably as good of a place to wrap. So. Beautiful.
I pat myself on the back.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. Speaking for myself, I feel like there's stuff that we didn't even get into. There's a whole bottomless pit of places to explore here still. Maybe we'll have you on again down the road, but it sounds like there's a lot to be excited about. This was honestly one of the more optimistic conversations we've had in a while. It was so great, such a pleasure to have you and offering your time and insight and intuitions.
That's funny. I'm almost never the optimist in the room.
I would say the same about myself. It's very weird to feel like that's what's so striking, is just coming to the end of this and recognizing, man, I'm.
There is I guess to the extent that I'm optimistic, I think there is an answer. Whether or not we get there remains to be seen, but at least I think there's an answer. So maybe in that sense that
got a good place to start.
That's an accurate way of saying, perhaps, that makes me more optimistic than other Unity podcast guests.
Fair enough. Well, do you have any parting words? Are there places you like for people to look for you, or would you prefer people not to look for you at all?
No. I actually am not on social media because I'm worried about the algorithms. I do have a Twitter account, but I actually am inactive. I'm a follower because I just don't want to get caught up in the negativity. I just don't think there's a lot of good. But I just really enjoyed this conversation. I'm very grateful for having the opportunity to have participated. Would love to have these conversations again at some point, if that's appropriate. And I really look forward to, even if not in podcast form, to having the chance to talk to other people and to express these ideas, and hopefully together we can collectively solve these riddles, because they're hard, but I do think we can.
Yeah. Are there currently, and this is forgive my ignorance here, but are the s'mores, are they still actively going on? Or is there any plans to kind of bring that back to life in some form or another?
That's a really good question. I primarily had interacted with Elizabeth. My sense is she's probably knee deep because she's trying to get her master's at Columbia. So I suspect that what happened with her is she probably got really involved because, it was about late fall and, the election was done and she was probably had a lot of schoolwork to do, but I should reach out to her and ask the question.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like a very valuable tool or sandbox to play in. And whether it takes that form or something similar under a new name or under a new roof, it sounds like if you build it, they will come, and that's the best we can hope for. Yeah. Well, again, Desmond Shirazi, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you again.
Yeah. This has been Unity Now. I'm Gabe Garber. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.
See ya.
Thanks for tuning in. For more conversations and content like this, be sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you prefer: Apple, Google, Spotify, etc. If you prefer to consume your podcasts in video format, you'll find full episodes and clips on YouTube. Follow the Unity Now podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram by clicking the links in the description below, and be sure to sign up and get involved at articlesofunity.org.